Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. The title is Advances in Pulmonary Arterial Hypertension, and I'm Luke Evans. I'm chairman of the Scleroderma Research Foundation. Briefly, just by way of personal introduction, I have a PhD in molecular biology, and I've been working as a professional venture capital investor in the biotech arena for a little over 30 years now. I'm also a scleroderma patient. I was diagnosed with the limited form of the disease in the late 1990s. And like so many of you, I'm committed to doing all I can to help the Scleroderma Research Foundation find a cure. Now, the organization was founded in 1987 by scleroderma patient activist Sharon Monsky, who was committed to build a foundation that would deliver life-changing results by bringing together the brightest minds in science and medicine to harness the power of technology to progress scleroderma research. Since our inception, the SRF has grown to be the largest nonprofit funder in scleroderma research in the US. We invest over 80% of our annual budget, over $2.6 million a year, in the most promising scleroderma research. We're also the creator and the largest sponsor of Conquer. This is the nation's only multi-center longitudinal study of scleroderma patients. And the SRF has partnered with 17 expert centers across the country to collect this clinical and research data. In short, we remain committed to finding better answers for treating patients. While our ultimate goal, of course, is to find a cure for scleroderma, the SRF also focuses our resources on helping to raise awareness and to provide education for people and their loved ones who are living with this disease, which is why I am honored to serve as host today for this educational webinar. Our featured presenter, Dr. Roham Zamanian, is the director of the Adult Pulmonary Hypertension Program at Stanford University. He specializes in the treatment of pulmonary hypertension, right heart failure, and pulmonary embolism. Dr. Zamanian is one of the foremost national experts, not only in PAH, the abbreviation for pulmonary arterial hypertension, but also in the clinical trials and drug development for pulmonary hypertension. Following his pre-recorded presentation on the latest advances in PAH research, Dr. Zamanian will join us live to take some of your questions. So please feel free to submit them in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen at any time during the webinar, and we will try to get to as many of them as time allows. And now let's go to the presentation. Thank you.
I'm Roham Zamanian, as you've already heard, and I'd like to take the time to talk to you about updates on the diagnosis and treatment of pulmonary hypertension, really research concepts that are relevant to systemic sclerosis-associated disease. Just share with you my disclosures. There's nothing that's going to impact my work here, but here are my disclosures so that you know. And you know, the discussion we're going to have today is about updates on the classification of pulmonary hypertension. Really, what is pulmonary hypertension? What are the hemodynamic definitions of this disease? And we have some new ones that are relevant, and updates on the treatments. So just starting with the classifications of pulmonary hypertension. Pulmonary hypertension is a broad syndrome of diseases caused by different etiologies. The one that's most pertinent to systemic sclerosis is the group 1 PAH associated with connective tissue disease, labeled here as 1.4.1. But the reality of scleroderma and scleroderma lung disease, as you will hear or have heard already, is that there is overlap with other relevant causes of pulmonary hypertension, including the interstitial lung disease that forms in patients with scleroderma. The fibrosis of the lung is also by itself a potential cause for pulmonary hypertension, and also some cardiac causes. Basically, group 2 and group 3 causes for pulmonary hypertension are relevant to patients with systemic sclerosis. So, we are always very careful to make sure we understand and what we call phenotype, to understand how the disease is formed and what are the other, if you will, organs that are impacted by systemic sclerosis. And in this case, not only do we have the pulmonary vasculature that are being impacted, but also the lungs, the meat of the lungs themselves, and the heart itself also. And the last thing I want to mention here before we move on to the other slides is under Group 1 PAH, there's a population called Group 1.6, patients with pulmonary veno-occlusive disease. This is a common finding in some patients with systemic sclerosis, and it complicates our therapy. It is basically a condition where the therapies actually sometimes cause a little bit more harm than good. So we always have to be careful about blood vessels in the lungs that are on the venous side that are affected by systemic sclerosis. So now that we have seen the sort of the broad overview of classification of pulmonary hypertension, how do I, as a clinician and a researcher, diagnose pulmonary hypertension? On the right-hand side is a schematic looking at the blood vessels, and on the bottom segment is a blood vessel that's completely occluded and what we call a plexiform lesion. If I could diagnose the disease by biopsying the lungs, I would, but that's a very dangerous proposition, and it's never done in pulmonary hypertension. So when a scleroderma patient sees their physician and has symptoms like shortness of breath or other symptoms that point to the lung, we always evaluate them for pulmonary hypertension. Pulmonary hypertension is diagnosed by a right heart catheterization, where the catheter goes through the neck or the groin into the lungs and through the heart to measure the pressures in the lungs. And pulmonary hypertension is defined as a mean pulmonary artery pressure, a mean pressure, not a systolic pressure, but a mean pressure of more than 25 millimeters of mercury. There's recent data that shows that a mean pulmonary pressure of more than 20 millimeters of mercury by itself can be diagnostic of, either early or established pulmonary hypertension. And this is really relevant for patients with scleroderma. But the problem here is that we don't have any clinical trials to look at the impact of drugs with just that new definition, that soft number, what we call mild or borderline pulmonary hypertension. So that's a concept that you should be aware of as well. The other new concept, and it has sort of grown from the research world in the diagnosis of pulmonary hypertension relevant to scleroderma, is the concept of exercise testing. So when we do a right heart catheterization, the patients come to the cath lab, they're given medications to make them comfortable, and they're at rest. They're basically sleeping during the procedure, and we measure the pressures. What is recognized now is that it is possible that pressures at rest are normal, but when a patient is walking or exerting themselves, when they really have symptoms, is that those pressures could be abnormal. So what we're starting to do is evaluate the pulmonary vascular response to exercise, and understanding that as a definition. There's been a lot of attention by the colleagues that you hear from, Dr. Chung and others, in identifying a population of scleroderma patients that are at risk for developing pulmonary hypertension. And those are the pre-pulmonary hypertension patients. The belief is that exercise is a way to diagnose those patients earlier. So in this graph, On the y-axis is the pulmonary artery pressure, the mean pulmonary artery pressure, and the x-axis is the cardiac output. And as you exercise a patient, usually the cardiac output increases on the x-axis from low to high. And that response, we could measure what happens to the pulmonary artery pressures. In a normal cohort of patients, the slope of that line is very shallow. In patients who have pulmonary hypertension, the slope of that line is steep. And so the studies that have been done in scleroderma identify the threshold of a slope. I'm sorry, it's not showing up very well here, but a threshold of 3. A slope of more than 3 identifies exercise-exacerbated pulmonary hypertension. And what you'll see here is the squares are normals, the open squares, sort of diamonds, are scleroderma patients. So you see the slope of the line is a little bit more acute than normals. Those scleroderma patients that have pulmonary hypertension or even borderline pulmonary hypertension have a slope that's more than 3, and those patients with significant pulmonary arterial hypertension have a very steep slope. So when you're being diagnosed for early pulmonary hypertension due to systemic sclerosis, or you may actually even participate in clinical trials or studies that will say, we want to see how you exercise, and we want to see the response of your pulmonary vasculature before and after a therapy, for example, to exercise. And this is a sort of a cutting edge concept, one that has been brewing for almost a decade now, but it's really prime time. And I think you will begin to see this in both the clinical and research settings. So I want to just shift a little bit to say, what are the treatment options that exist currently for the diagnosis of group 1 PAH? And all these patients are applicable to patients with systemic sclerosis. So there's traditional therapies like supplemental oxygen, diuretics that reduce the volume, sometimes anticoagulants, not usually for systemic sclerosis patients. But the PAH therapies that have been approved fall into 4 categories: the prostacyclins, the endothelin receptor antagonists, the PDE5 inhibitors, and the cyclic guanylate cyclase activators. All of these therapies have been tested in group 1 PAH and approved currently, and all of them are available for use in patients with systemic sclerosis. I'll come back to this in a second, but studying scleroderma only cohort of patients creates a major challenge for investigators in a rare disease. And I was one of those investigators studying an or an immune suppressive therapy that I'll talk to you about. So one of the concepts in scleroderma associated pulmonary hypertension is not only this issue of overlap of you might have lung disease, you might have heart disease, but also how do we identify those patients which are the rare of the rare and study them specifically with agents? And I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the neat things about the recent investigations in PAH that are related, that could relate more to systemic sclerosis patients, is the use of immune modulating therapies and those that have impact on metabolism and fibrosis that may be related to the mechanisms relevant to just all scleroderma. And I think that that's the most exciting part of things. But I'd like to speak initially with about a couple of therapies, the endothelin receptor antagonists and the PDE5 inhibitors that are used as combination, and then get into some of the immune therapies and an example of that in a second for you. This concept, what I was mentioning a little bit earlier, is that there are many investigational agents and their mechanisms listed on the slide that are relevant not only to pulmonary hypertension as it exists today as vasodilators, for example, on the right-hand side, but concepts that have really brewed but have come to the forefront of therapy. We know that obviously inflammation is a major player and autoimmunity is a major player in systemic sclerosis. Well, now we have therapies that we're testing that their mechanism of action is through, impacting that inflammation and impacting the immune cells that are responsible for the inflammation and autoimmunity that is as a part of systemic sclerosis. So it's very exciting that we're testing now strategies that for pulmonary hypertension that have a mechanistic relevance to systemic sclerosis. The others that have the same kind of relevance include the extracellular matrix remodeling agents, elastases and metalloproteinases that are being tested currently now. And there is a good amount of evidence to show that mitochondrial metabolism and neurohormonal activation is abnormal across scleroderma, and we're testing therapies that impact that for pulmonary hypertension as well. So it's an exciting era in research for therapies for pulmonary hypertension, but more and more relevant to systemic sclerosis. So the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is the combination of ambrisentan and tadalafil, and an endothelin receptor antagonist and a vasodilator, tadalafil, as upfront therapies for patients with systemic sclerosis associated PAH. This is the work that was led by our colleagues at Johns Hopkins, and we were fortunate enough to contribute. In this study, we studied 24 patients in an open label study of the combination therapy for about 36 weeks. And we studied them for the dual upfront therapy. They were treatment naive at the beginning. And we studied their hemodynamics. We studied their walking capacity, how they felt, how they functioned, and their cardiac function as well. And what was really interesting is here is a table that I'll show you from baseline to week 36, which was the endpoint. And if you looked at the bottom where it says functional status, one of the primary things that we'd like to look at is the 6-minute walking distance. And in this study, the baseline 6-minute walking distance of these patients were 343 meters that went up to 395 meters. So those patients were able to increase their walking distance by a whole 50 meters, which is really great to see. They reduced their reporting of symptoms of breathlessness. The dyspnea Borg score went down, and the functional class, how they felt with pulmonary hypertension and their exercise tolerance as reported by them appeared to lessen. A majority of the patients went from a class 3, which is a fairly advanced set of symptoms, to a class 2 a reporting of functional status. But what is really most impressive in this study are the impact this we could show in the pulmonary vascular resistance, the occlusion of those blood vessels in the lungs, and the higher the occlusion, the higher that PVR number. So you see that number on a median level went from somewhere around a 6.5 to somewhere less than 4. And you see a tremendous change in a variety of patients, majority of them going from a very significant amount of pressure or resistance of more than 8 Wood units down to much lower. At the same time, when we look at the right ventricular ejection fraction, so the contractility of the right heart, we could show that over a period of 36 weeks, these patients benefited from these therapies by increasing their ventricular fractional ejection fraction, so how active that contraction of the right ventricle was. We were basically feeling that we were rescuing that right ventricle from a failure state in at least a good proportion of these patients. So this data was published in 2015, and it gives you a sort of a clue that the routine therapies that we have for pulmonary hypertension. In this case, dual upfront therapy was beneficial for patients with systemic sclerosis. Very unusual to have a very small study that focuses on systemic sclerosis. So to round this out here a little bit for you and to finish up, I want to talk to you about a study that the NIH, the NIAID sponsored in the United States, led by myself and Mark Nichols here at Stanford. And we postulated that B-cell depletion using rituximab could be effective as a therapeutic for pulmonary arterial hypertension in patients with systemic sclerosis. So we proposed a randomized, double-blind control study of patients with systemic sclerosis who had had the disease diagnosed with at least PAH for less than 5 years. So they didn't have a fibrotic component of disease. Fibrotic means that the blood vessels still had some inflammation that we could address. And we looked at the role of rituximab. I have to tell you, this study was very difficult to complete. And in fact, at the end of the study, we had recruited about 62 patients over an 8 to 9 year period of time. And the difficulty just really identified the issue that we have in studying systemic sclerosis, that there are only a few expert centers or a growing amount. You have wonderful in organizations like the Scleroderma Research Foundation that can be partners to enable this kind of study. And I think that that's a challenge that needs to be met going forward if we're going to investigate, very sort of critical and specific therapies for systemic sclerosis. So I'll just pass this on by saying that there was a well-controlled study. Rituximab patients, about 29 and about 28 placebo patients that received the drug over a period of the study. And in short, to say that the primary endpoint of the study was the 6-minute walking distance at 24 weeks, and the secondary endpoint was the same measure but modeled over 48 weeks. And we showed a significant improvement of about 25.5 meters placebo corrected over 24 weeks with the therapy, but we didn't hit the primary endpoint. And one of the reasons is we missed it by just a couple of feet. But we believe in blue, the rituximab demonstrated an improvement in exercise capacity compared to placebo patients. And what is interesting in blue here is you could relate that improvement in exercise capacity to the reduction of the B cells. So the B cells are shown here in dashed lines, both in the blue, the rituximab group, and in the placebo group. And you see that placebo didn't affect the B cells at all because that was just saline. But you see that patients who received rituximab, their B cells went down. And by 24 weeks, they were at a very good low level. One of the mistakes that we made in this study is we didn't redose patients with rituximab. And I think we really, really should have tried to do that. We showed that the therapy was safe for patients. But at this point, the study wasn't well powered enough to prove an efficacy. So unfortunately, it's not an FDA-approved agent for the treatment of PAH associated with scleroderma, but I think it's something that needs to be studied, a concept that needs to be studied. And then finally in this study, what we did was the last bit, and I'm glad to share the publication with anyone who's interested, is we used machine learning and artificial intelligence to identify the signatures of patients who would respond, who had the best response to rituximab. And we published that information. I think that's something that we can now do using technology, using aggressive potential immune therapies to really address a subtype of PAH as here, a systemic sclerosis associated PAH. There are many, many studies that are ongoing. Some of them have failed in pulmonary hypertension that are relevant to systemic sclerosis. One, unfortunately, failure was the mitochondrial drug bardoxolone methyl. But there are many, many more to come. And we're really looking forward to those therapies that are immune modulating, especially the study of tacrolimus, which is going to be going fairly quickly. A couple of agents addressing BMPR2 signaling, which we know that's relevant in scleroderma, and a whole bunch of other studies hopefully coming forward evaluating inflammation and autoimmunity. So I really appreciate your time today, and really excited to be in this forum. Looking forward to taking some questions. But ultimately, my point here is there's a lot of exciting research and a lot of exciting clinical developments and relevant to systemic sclerosis and pulmonary hypertension, but the challenges exist for enrollment as a subclass of a rare disease. And I think organizations such as the Scleroderma Research Foundation are really at the intersection point of enabling novel research in a population of patients that it serves. So thank you very much for your consideration and your attention, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Zamanian. And that's, I think, a great background for our Q&A session. We have had a number of people who've submitted questions, but I'm going to go ahead and just take the lead and ask one or two of my own just to while we're queuing up the rest. You mentioned about exercise exacerbated PAH, and I'm just curious, has that changed sort of the way you think about the diagnosis of PAH, and when do you start to think about treating patients? Is the exercise-induced PAH now the threshold for considering therapy, or do you wait for, or does that just put you on high alert that that's a patient that might ultimately convert into one that requires therapy?
Yeah, hello. That's a really great question. Thanks for asking it. I think there are no clinical trials that have proven efficacy of our therapies in either early diagnosis or exercise exacerbated. But this is very much a conversation I have with my patients. And in patients with systemic sclerosis, this is really at the front line. We want to make the diagnosis early and be aggressive in therapy. So, I think my own practice, I really consider the symptom that the patients are presenting with. And for sure, I could say that I've treated some patients who I believe have exercise exacerbated pulmonary hypertension. The second thing that I didn't really mention in that, but is becoming more and more important, that is the definitions are now changing. The scleroderma community has done a really great job identifying pre-PAH, sort of this evolution to developing pulmonary hypertension. But the broader PH field has now reduced the thresholds of pulmonary artery pressure and pulmonary vascular resistance definitions just last year, even to much lower. Problem now is that there is a vacuum of a lack of evidence, and all the therapies are indicated for only patients with established rest PAH. So to bring it back, I do think we need a lot more research in that front. When I have my patients with scleroderma, it's a conversation. It's a conversation that I believe therapies for these early phases will help, but they could also have toxicities, and we have to be really careful about that. So we're in a little bit of an evidence-free zone, but I'm hoping in the next 10 years or so that collaborative colleagues, industry will pick up and begin to study these early phenomenon.
Great. And then just maybe while we're on that topic, it sounds like you've run that recent clinical trial where you did frontline dual therapy. It sounds like your sort of threshold for immediately doing combination therapy has obviously been reduced based on that evidence. I'm just curious, do you see yourself then adding on third medications, or if if you see progression on, let's say, dual therapy, do you switch? Maybe it would be interesting to sort of help the audience understand sort of sequencing of therapies a little bit. Just you put a number of different mechanisms up.
Absolutely. So the recent guidelines out of the European College of Cardiology and Respiratory Societies have also come out saying that patients with significant disease, early therapy should be a dual upfront oral therapy. We combine PDE5s with ERAs or soluble guanylate cyclase activators with ERAs. In my mind, IV and subcutaneous therapies with aggressive prostacyclins has always been one of the most effective therapies, but it comes with the caveat of having a central line in or being infused 24 hours a day. So in my mind, I actually sometimes choose an IV prostacyclin instead of the two therapies. And then we look at how the patients are progressing, and we not only evaluate them clinically, but there is this concept of risk stratification now that has come up. And if the risk stratification of the patients, those risk scores are high, meaning that their likelihood of having a poor prognosis is very high, we add a third therapy. You know, unfortunately, in our field, no one has studied the sort of switching therapies for one another, and that's really, the evidence is really lacking. So typically we practice step-up therapy, and now we're anticipating a fourth type of drug being approved. I think the chat mentioned the sotatercept, which is a potential if you will, a genetic modifier, whatever we want to call it. But that's a fourth agent now. And in the near future, we may see addition of 3 drugs to 4 drugs even. So to answer your question, I think that should be the expectation, either an aggressive upfront therapy or an aggressive by single therapy by IV, and then addition to it. And I think maybe in the future, people will study paradigms of switching, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up sotatercept, obviously, and we've seen a number of comments on that. Obviously, great to have another brand new mechanism of action brought forward, sort of in the whole BMP2 activin sort of biological pathway. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you've seen in the data and some of your thoughts about sort of how that might fit into clinical practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that it's very exciting because for many years, it's been really difficult to show a treatment response. And in the phase 2 study, and now apparently in the phase 3 study, the data have not been presented, but there's been a press release of a very positive phase 3 result. That it's really impactful. And I think the kudos to the investigators. First of all, they designed the trial really very well and recruited aggressively for it. But then the second thing is I believe in the mechanism. So as I mentioned in my talk, the idea of modifying or improving BMPR signaling is really one that's really hitting the community. Sotatercept tends to do that, but there are other therapies. There are some companies that are beginning to study BMP9 modulation, and we did some work early on with already an existing compound, FK506 tacrolimus, which is an immune suppressant, but also activates and increases BMPR2 signaling. That trial hopefully will go to phase 2 next year. But I think what you will see in general is, first of all, very exciting news about sotatercept. I'll be really interested to see how it impacts patients with systemic sclerosis. But then we're moving away from vasodilators. We're moving towards compounds that have the potential for vascular remodeling. And I think that's really highly relevant to inflammatory and fibrotic diseases such as systemic sclerosis, because you're not just depending on healthy or viable blood vessels that could be dilated, you're actually hoping to reverse remodel some of that vasculature.
Mhm.
And we actually hope to see systemic effects of that. For
Mhm.
example, so we studied the FK506, as I mentioned, and some
Mhm.
colleagues from Europe, some patients from Europe wrote us that said, my nosebleed is reducing. My patients with HHT were reporting reduced epistaxis, nasal bleeding from the drug. So we think that these therapies, whether it's sotatercept, FK506, will have systemic manifestations. And hopefully, my fingers are crossed, is you'll see some of the harder manifestations of systemic sclerosis being impacted if these drugs are impactful. The distal vascular symptoms, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal symptoms. So we'll see. So I'm very hopeful. It's a really exciting era, but it's also becoming more and more difficult to study because a lot of patients are now on background therapies.
Mhm. But I believe the sotatercept study was done on top of background therapy. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But
Yeah.
not everybody qualified for it. You had to have a pulmonary vascular resistance that was more than 5 Woods units, 4 or 5 Woods units. And one of the things that we quickly learned really quickly in the rituximab study is with
Mhm.
systemic sclerosis, those pulmonary vascular resistances are soft. And so, I think that's a challenge specifically for the scleroderma community.
Right. So there's a couple other questions that are, so I think, really related to, I think, remodeling, or let's say sort of, which, whether it's stem cell, stem cell additions, or whether that's before or after chemoablation, I guess, or just, I guess other sort of more aggressive disease modifying therapies. Anything that you want to point our audience to in terms of things that are on the horizon, maybe to keep an eye on? I don't think those are so close to approval yet, but maybe things that you're watching on the research end.
Oh yeah, thank you for that opportunity. I think I would, as a patient, I would be more and more inclined to look at, specifically with scleroderma, immune modulating or BMPR2 modulating therapies. I think you'll see a number of those proposals coming down. Stem cell work is ongoing. For a while, we were trying to get the CERM group interested in a stem cell specific project, and now colleagues in Canada and some in the US are interested in looking at autologous stem cell as a therapeutic approach. That's ongoing. Hopefully, that'll come down the pike. And I think the other thing that you'll see is and I think it's alluded in the chat here, is not every patient is a clean group 1 phenotype. So some patients have interstitial lung disease. Some patients have heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. That's mentioned here in the chat. And there are studies that are coming down to evaluate those patients, the patients with both pulmonary fibrosis and lung disease with PH therapies, as well as those with heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Merck is studying sotatercept in a study called Cadence, which is looking at HFpEF associated PH. And I think both of these, diastolic heart failure, which is what we call HFpEF, and also lung disease associated pulmonary hypertension, are highly relevant to the scleroderma population. So I think those are the things that I would be on the lookout for. And then maybe this is sort of, but just in terms of sort of, I see a number of questions here for sort of general life hacks for, patients who either, have, let's say, early PAH. I mean, are there things that you encourage your patients to do diet-wise, exercise-wise, sort of lifestyle modification? Is that, anything that's the patients might be interested to hear? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the hallmark of this disease is the shortness of breath and reduction and limitation in exercise it causes. But I think there have been historically few sort of lines of thought about this. There are some colleagues for example, in Japan that mandate bed rest for patients with pulmonary hypertension, and I think that idea has sort of gone away. So I think what we have shown, what we as a community practice, and there was a German study in about a decade ago that demonstrated this, that exercise is critical and physical rehabilitation is very, very important. The more you stay physically active, the less deconditioned the muscle system becomes, and actually, to be honest, the better quality of life these patients report. So, I think remaining active is really important. It's really hard to say do X, Y, and Z because there are people who have pulmonary hypertension that do a significant amount of exercise, biking, running, all that. And there are some patients that are very limited, but they can still walk. And I think engaging yourself to do what you can without creating dangerous symptoms. So I tell my patients, if you feel lightheaded or chest pain, don't do that. But everything beyond that, I want my patients to remain very active. Healthy diet is important. We stress low salt diet because of the fact that salt and water worsen heart failure. That's critical. And I think that's just general guidances. Beyond that, I would just say follow what if you have a cardiologist or a primary care physician, follow the guidances that they give you. Great.
Yeah. And then in terms of an annual monitoring protocol, what do you, I think you talked a little bit about it, but maybe just to solidify that for the patients that are online here, what is your sort of annual monitoring protocol for patients who have either early or confirmed PAH?
Yeah, I think that's first of all, connecting with a center that you feel comfortable and is now a center of excellence. There are now scleroderma centers of excellence that also have tied into pulmonology and cardiology practices that are pulmonary hypertension centers of excellence. So I would make sure, first of all, when you get first diagnosed, you connect with them. And then, we generally put patients on a trajectory of follow-up depending on how severe they are. The more severe you are, the more closer you follow up with us. And the less severe, or if you have what we would consider pre-pulmonary hypertension or mildly elevated pulmonary vascular pressures, then or even just have a risk factor of scleroderma and we're worried that you might develop pulmonary hypertension, then on an annual basis, we do pulmonary function testing, we do echocardiography. Sometimes we actually perform exercise echocardiography to see how the heart does with exercise. It's really, really important to have a finger on that, and the physicians, well-trained physicians, will know what signals to look for. But ultimately, what I think I made the point is you can be followed for many years and have an understanding with your physician when it's time to really make the diagnosis. And I often have a conversation of saying, what do we need to do to make you feel comfortable and make me feel comfortable that you don't or you do have pulmonary hypertension? And ultimately is that right heart catheterization. And when done with expert hands, it's a fairly simple, invasive, but procedure that is minimally risky when done appropriately. So, yes, a routine follow-up. I think, Luke, you mentioned that whether you have PH or don't have PH, you design a follow-up protocol with your physician that you feel comfortable with. And if there's concerns for shortness of breath and possible pulmonary hypertension, but you don't really have it, you should be seeing someone on an annual basis with testing to make sure that the diagnosis is caught as early as possible.
Great. I'm going to take just one or two more questions, but You mentioned a little bit about subsegmentation and ability. When you talked a little bit about it in Rituxan and talked about the best responders, it sort of implies that there's some biomarkers, at least for that basically class of therapies. But maybe more generally, are you able to split this population down now and identify other progressors, or are there features, other clinical or non-clinical features that enable you to sort of track people to sort of, the most appropriate therapies?
Oh yeah, so I think that's really the edge of science at the moment, with advancing analytic methodology with artificial intelligence and using machine learning and big data. That's really the hope, and also including the sort of the molecular phenotyping of patients, understanding what genes and proteins are emphasized in each person. So, the work is ongoing. There isn't currently any magical sort of markers that will tell me and refine what therapy I should apply for which patient. But people are hoping that would be the case. And the other thing that people are beginning to do is not only using that therapeutically upfront, but trying to validate this in clinical trials. So this sort of an enrichment that will happen based on whether you're a carrier of a certain phenotype or not. And then the other spectrum of what you might be asking is what we are quite advanced in is methodology to risk stratify patients. Some risk scores are fairly small and use more symptoms. Some risk scores, like the REVEAL risk score, use a variable number of clinical markers. And using those, we are able to guide therapy, not specifically, but the timing and the aggressiveness of the approach. If you can achieve a low risk status based on some of those risk scores, meaning the prognosis is really good, then we lay off on aggressive therapies. Whereas if you say high risk, we move forward. So, I think very specific to systemic sclerosis, that part of what our paper was a proof of concept. I hope that in the future you'll see the use of more of these molecular sort of mechanistically relevant stratifiers and identifiers of who responds to what therapy and who doesn't. And hopefully that'll guide the future. We're not there yet, unfortunately.
Right. Well, I believe we have come to the end, and that was a fantastic session, Dr. Zamanian. Really appreciate your willingness to cover the very broad range of questions and comments, and for your deep insights into the disease, particularly as it relates to our patient population, scleroderma.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Luke, and everyone. It's really wonderful, the work that SRF is doing for the patients and collaborating with the physicians. So it's really my pleasure, and I'm available anytime to help.
Well, that's really generous. Thanks again, Dr. Zamanian. It's much appreciated. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank our partner sponsor for today, and that's Janssen Pharmaceuticals. They've been instrumental in making not only today's webinar available for our patients, but really all of our efforts to highlight pulmonary hypertension, particularly during this National PAH Awareness Month. And for those watching, thank you so much for joining us. And if you know of others who would be interested in the information that we've been able to share today, or any of the Scleroderma Research Foundation's other educational resources, please visit or have your loved ones visit our website, srfcure.org. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye for now.